Happy Friday the 13th, boys and girls. I'm coming at you with another movie review, and that is Friday the 13th Part 2. Now, my DVD copy here was actually signed by Warrington Gillette, who is one of the actors who played Jason in the film. Now, Friday the 13th Part 2 came out in 1981, and this, of course, is a sequel to the 1980s slasher movie classic Friday the 13th. Now, I already reviewed this along with all the other Friday the 13th movies all the way back in 2011 for Season 1 of Horror Month. Those reviews are still up, however they're no longer public. They're now marked as unlisted, but you can still see them on the Horror Month Season 1 playlist, which I'll leave in the description below. And I also recently did a new review on the original Friday the 13th, which you can see on the playlist for Horror Month Season 13. Now, when the original Friday the 13th was being made, and when it came out, there was no intention of there ever being sequels, but Friday the 13th, despite getting mixed to poor critical reviews, was a massive hit at the box office, and it prompted Paramount, who only distributed the first film, but now own the rights to the Friday the 13th title, to immediately rush a sequel into production. Now, when it became clear that Friday the 13th was becoming a franchise, I think it was Sean S. Cunningham who pitched the idea to make Friday the 13th an anthology series where each film in the series is a standalone story that just happens to take place on Friday the 13th. John Carpenter had a very similar idea for the Halloween franchise, which is why we got Halloween 3, but ultimately Paramount decided to do a direct sequel to the original film. This time around, the film was written by Ron Kurz and directed by Steve Miner, who worked as an assistant director on the first movie, and he would go on to direct Friday the 13th Part 3, as well as movies like Soul Man, House, Warlock, Forever Young, Halloween H2O, Lake Placid, and unfortunately he did that crappy Day of the Dead remake from 2008. He also directed episodes of shows like The Wonder Years, Chicago Hope, Dawson's Creek, and Smallville. Now, this is the film that officially established Jason Voorhees, the boy who is said to have died before the events of the first movie, as the main antagonist of this series. Now, I do want to point out that I think pretty much everybody who worked on the first movie, from Sean S. Cunningham to Victor Miller to, I think, even Tom Savini, were completely against the idea of making Jason the killer this time around, because despite that dream sequence at the end of the first movie and the subtle implication that Jason's ghost might be haunting the lake, as far as they were concerned, Jason was dead and was just another victim. They hated the idea of making Jason the villain. And even as a fan of these movies, it is kind of a major plot hole, because they never explain in this movie how exactly Jason came back. I mean, they sort of imply in this movie that perhaps Jason never actually did drown, and he was just living out in the woods this whole time as sort of a feral boy, but became murderous after Pamela died. But that kinda makes no sense whatsoever, because it's like, how the fuck come he didn't just go back to Pamela? And it kinda negates the whole point of the first movie. But later on in the series, they sort of retcon that idea, and they suggest that Jason actually did die in 1957, but he came back as sort of a revenant, and I'm not gonna lie, this is one of those weird cases where the supernatural explanation kinda makes a lot more sense than the non-supernatural explanation. Now, all that being said, despite that major plot hole, and despite this movie hitting a lot of the same story beats as the first one, I'm not gonna lie, I actually think Friday the 13th Part 2 is a better film than the first one. And I love the first movie, don't get me wrong, but Friday the 13th Part 2 I think is a more well-made film. I think it has better characters. I think it's a more well-paced film. And despite some plot holes, I actually think it's a more smartly written film than you might be expecting. Now, the movie itself is actually kind of a pastiche of several different horror films. For example, throughout a lot of this this movie, Jason wears a burlap sack over his head, and apparently his look in this movie was specifically inspired by the villain from the movie The Town That Dreaded Sundown. This movie also has elements that reminded me a lot of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. For example, in the movie, Jason is essentially a deformed man with the mind of a child, and that reminded me a lot of Leatherface. And also, there's a scene in this movie where you see this shack that Jason has been living in, and it felt like something right out of Texas Chainsaw. Also, there are some kill sequences in this movie that are directly ripping off the Mario Bava film Bay of Blood. In fact, there are some scenes in this movie that are almost shot-for-shot remakes of scenes from the movie Bay of Blood. So the plot of Friday the 13th Part 2 is it begins a few months after the events of the first movie, and we follow Alice, who is the only survivor of Pamela Voorhees' massacre, who ultimately had to kill Pamela in self-defense. She's now kind of trying to put her life together again, and she's clearly deeply traumatized by what happened. Now, this is technically a spoiler, but it happens right in the opening scene. We see Alice get killed by an unseen assailant who we eventually learn was Jason. The movie then jumps ahead to 5 years later, meaning they don't say it, but technically this movie's set in the future, and that's actually something you'll notice if you watch all these movies in a row, is as these films go on, the timeline gets all kinds of fucked up in terms of when exactly these movies are supposed to be taking place, and arguably that timeline discrepancy starts with this movie. But basically, it's 5 years later, and we follow this group of teenagers and young adults who come to this camp counselor training center that has recently opened up, literally on the same lake as Camp Crystal Lake, and it turns out that Jason, who is believed to be dead all these years, is very much alive. Now, whether he's undead or was just alive this whole time is sort of left up to interpretation, but now he starts picking them off one by one, because it's now his mission to punish anybody who returns to the lake. So, the film stars Amy Steele as our final girl, Ginny, and Ginny is a great character. She's actually considered by a lot of Friday the 13th fans to be one of, if not the best final girl from this entire franchise. Like, she's very intelligent and resourceful, and they do some clever things with this character where we find out she's actually studying child psychology, and she's actually able to use this to her advantage when she realizes that Jason has the mind of a child. Like, there's actually a point towards the end of the movie where she's able to convince Jason, at least for a brief period, that she's the reincarnation of his mother. Which is why I said the movie's actually a little more smartly written than you might be expecting. And Ginny is also a really funny and charming character as well. I also met Amy Steele back in 2019 at a screening of this movie, and she was freaking awesome. She could not have been nicer. You also have John Furey as Paul, Ginny's boyfriend, and Paul is actually a pretty likable character as well. He's the head of the camp counselor training center, like, he's the one running the whole thing, and he is sort of an authority figure there, but he's also like a really chill, laid-back guy. I also love when they come back from a bar, he finds some pot, and he just says, "These kids smoke better dope than I do." And that's what I like about these earlier Friday the 13th movies, is the characters, while certainly not being the most three-dimensional characters on paper, they're still likable in some ways, and still somewhat believable, and you feel bad when Jason goes after them. Now, probably my favorite character in the movie was the character of Ted, played by Stuart Charno. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, but Ted was a really fun character. He's sort of the comic relief, and he is kind of an analog to the character of Ned from the first movie, but Ted is a much better character than Ned. Like, Ted is a prankster, but he definitely doesn't cross some of the lines that Ned did in the first movie. But Ted does play a pretty epic prank on the characters of Jeff and Sandra at the beginning of the film. Now, the characters of Jeff and Sandra are very similar to the characters of Jack and Marcy from the first movie, which is why I said this movie does hit a lot of the same beats as the first one, and a common criticism against the Friday the 13th movies is they are very formulaic and they are very samey, but Jeff and Sandra are actually really likable characters. Now, I want to point out the character of Sandra, even though she dies in this movie, she would oddly enough become kind of an important character in this franchise because her brother is one of the main characters of the fourth Friday the 13th movie. Now, actress Marta, who plays Sandra in the film, was apparently only 16 when they started shooting this, which wouldn't be a big deal except for the fact that the actor playing her boyfriend, Bill Randolph, I think is the actor's name, was, I believe, in his late 20s when they were working on this movie, which again, wouldn't be a big deal except for the fact that there's a sex scene in this movie involving these two characters. Now, I want to make it clear that at the time, nobody knew how old she actually was, but when it was found out that she was a minor, because the sex scene was originally much more graphic, they immediately cut that. But dear God, I can only imagine how awkward that must be for the actor playing her boyfriend. Now, another character who really stands out in this movie is the character of Mark, played by Tom McBride, who's actually in a wheelchair, and there's this really kinda sad moment in the film where this girl who's trying to get with him asks him if it's permanent, and he says, "The doctors think so, but I don't. I don't intend to be in this thing forever." And so you realize that he's determined to eventually walk again, which makes his death in the movie all the more sad and tragic, and he has probably the film's most infamous death scene just because of how cruel it is. You also have Walt Gorney reprising the role of Crazy Ralph, and he's great in the movie, but unfortunately he's not in the movie that much. You also have Betsy Palmer coming back to play Pamela in a hallucination. And of course you have Adrienne reprising the role of Alice in the opening sequence of the film. Now, the fact that they kill Alice off rather unceremoniously might piss off some fans of the first movie. Now, I've heard sort of conflicting reasons for why Alice's role was reduced in this movie. I know Adrienne was dealing with a stalker in real life around this time, and I had always heard the reason she wasn't in this movie that much is because she requested it because she kind of wanted to get out of the public spotlight after this stalking incident, but I also heard it was because her agent was asking for too much money, so they decided to make Alice's role just a glorified cameo in this movie. But then I also heard that Adrienne was apparently shocked that they killed Alice off in the opening scene, and she fully expected to be the main character again, and apparently wanted to be in the movie longer. Now, one thing I do gotta point out about the opening scene is, how the fuck did Jason get to Alice's apartment? I mean, granted, maybe this is an apartment she recently rented that is in the Crystal Lake area. That's the only thing that really makes sense, because I don't think Jason can drive, and Jason doesn't come off to me as the kind of person who could just take a bus, especially looking the way he does. And honestly, the supernatural explanation for Jason might fill in that plot hole a little bit, but at the end of the day, this was before they decided to go outright supernatural with this character. Now, from what I understand, Jason was actually played by several actors in this movie. Now, the actor who got the credit for playing Jason was Warrington Gillette, but Warrington Gillette, from what I understand, only played Jason in a few shots in the movie, and he did play Jason at the end where you see him unmasked and you see what he looks like under the burlap sack. but the actor who apparently played Jason the most throughout this movie was Steve Daskewisz. And it's actually kind of a point of contention among fans, and even some people who worked on the movie, is who actually played Jason the most throughout the film. And as I pointed out before, I actually met Warrington Gillette and got him to sign my copy of the movie, and he was a nice enough guy, but at the same time though, if you're not the only one who played Jason in the film, you should kinda make that known. But as I said before, I love Friday the 13th Part 2. I think it's an excellent slasher film, and it does follow the same basic formula as the first one. Again, it has very similar characters, and even has some very similar scenes to the first one, but for some reason I feel this one kind of improves upon some things from the first film. And even though the criticism that it is basically just a loose remake of the first film is not invalid, somehow, at least to me, it still feels fresh. And some of that, I think, might be owed to the fact that Steve Miner, I'll say it, I think is probably a better filmmaker than Sean S. Cunningham, and I don't think Cunningham is bad by any means, but Cunningham has outright admitted that he's a producer first and a director second, whereas Steve Miner seems to at least take the artistry of filmmaking a little more seriously. And the movie does have some genuinely creepy moments, like towards the end of the film when Ginny and Paul come back from the bar, and this is after Jason has already killed a significant number of people, but they don't know it yet. But they come into the house and the room is completely dark and they're both kind of drunk, but then Ginny thinks she sees something, but she's not sure, and then when she finally does see Jason, it's like this huge fucking shock, and shit like that always creeped me out. This idea that somebody could be in the room with you, but you don't really know it because you're inebriated or it's just too dark to see. And the fact that Jason keeps his own mother's head as sort of a shrine really is kind of creepy and disturbing when you stop to think about it. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to an audio clip of my late friend Chris Mano giving his thoughts on Friday the 13th Part 2. Now, this was taken from a 2018 retrospective on the Friday the 13th franchise I did with my friends.
This one is just like pure escalation, you know, because like they're starting to realize that this is going to be a franchise and they want to see what they can do with it. So they bring back Jason from the dead, and obviously like he's a behemoth and stuff like that. He's only wearing the sack, he's not wearing the hockey mask yet. And it's kind of starting to form the tropes that will inform these movies. So it definitely is an important one in that way. And other than that, I mean, it's a fun watch too, because like they bring back Betsy, you know, there's some really good kills in it. Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Here's my friend John giving his thoughts on Friday the 13th Part 2.
Here are my thoughts on Friday the 13th Part 2. As usual with any first horror movie, when it makes money and it's a big success, they figured, let's make a sequel and let's franchise the character. This is the first movie where Jason was the killer. The first movie was Pamela Voorhees' movie. This time it was Jason's movie. I wish the character Alice was kept alive, but because around this time the actress had some crazy stalker at the time, that is why she got her screen time short and have her character be killed off 5 minutes in the opening scene. If they wanted to kill off her character, maybe it could have been done later, like where she tries to save Jeannie from Jason, but again, there was a reason why Alice was killed off early in this movie for that reason. It makes sense for Jason to kill off Alice because Alice killed Jason's mother, Pamela Voorhees, in the last movie. This is another Psycho reference. Marion Crane was killed early in the movie, so was Alice. It was directed by Steve Miner. When I first saw this movie, I was familiar with him because he would go on to direct Halloween H2O a decade later. As I said before, that's my favorite Halloween sequel. He's probably the only director I can think of who directed a Halloween, a Friday the 13th movie. Steve Miner also directed Friday the 13th Part 3, which I'll talk about next. Unlike Halloween, which had recurring characters of Dr. Loomis and Laurie Strode, who knew about Michael Myers, from here onward, each movie created new characters and did not always bring back the same characters from the last movie. except for Tommy Jarvis, which I'll talk about soon. Crazy Rob's another recurring character from the last movie. He dies in this movie. Again, just like the first movie, it's a little bit slow at first, but then it picks up the last half when Jean and her boyfriend fight Jason. The finale was okay and decent, but not as good as the first movie finale when Alice and Pamela fight. Jason continues his mom's legacy in killing any more counselors who go to Camp Crystal Lake. Once again, the characters are nothing special or well written, but I did think Amy Steele as Jeannie was slight semi-upgrade to Alice, but that's just my opinion. This is the kind of movie that is B-movie quality. This is not an Academy Award material, that's for sure. On the Blu-ray set they have an interview with Amy Steele she did on a podcast. I highly recommend you go check that out if you ever own this on Blu-ray. Just like the first movie, another dude pranks a girl he likes, but again, he's such a dick. He slingshots a rock at her behind while she's walking in the woods. Later she goes skinny dipping, then he steals her clothes. Again, what a jerk. He gets his punishment when he gets caught in a trap hanging upside down. I like the campfire scene where the guy is telling the story of Jason Voorhees like an urban legend type of story. But then again, I always like scenes like that in movies, campfire scenes. I did like the scene where Jason finds Jeannie wearing Jason's mother's shirt and pretending to be her so she can kill him. This part was very clever. I guess Jason can only see a reflection of his mom and cannot see Jeannie. When Jeannie finds Jason's mother decapitated head, it reminds me of Psycho when Marion Crane's sister finds Norma Bates' decomposed body in the basement. This scene's been pointed out by fans with a little bit of psychology on why Jason kills. Seeing Jason wear a sag was kind of lame, but at the same time, they did not think at the time of the hockey mask yet. That was not established yet when this movie was made. When people see this movie, it will be hard for them to sink their teeth into not realize that before the hockey mask, this is one of the first Jason Voorhees designs. Well, it's not perfect, not one of my favorite sequels of the series. It had some okay highlight moments.
And the next audio clip you're going to hear is from this guy named Joey, who is a fan of my channel, who wanted to take part in these Friday the 13th videos. So here are his thoughts on Friday the 13th Part 2.
Part 2 is really, really cool too. Of course, Part 1 was really the best, but Part 2 is really good too. It's really cool. And a lot say that it's the best in the series. I have to agree too that it is. And Adrienne King, she's in it again too. It also stars Steve Dash as he does some of the stunts. I actually had a poster signed by Steve Dash because I met him at one time, and I'm still kicking myself yet because by accident I threw it out when I was cleaning my room, but I did meet him. I'm glad I still have his picture and stuff, and he's really a nice guy. He was really a nice guy, and the shame part is not too long after I met him, he died, but he was really, really a nice guy. And I met him, and he took a picture with me with a machete. You know, it was really, really cool. Like I say, I really fucked up that day with, I'm still kicking myself. I got rid of the poster. I was cleaning my room, but anyway, as far as the movie goes, like I say, a lot say it's the best in the series. I have to say it's one of the best in the series too. And of course, Part 1 was really good, but Part 2 is really cool too. And it was from the 80s, 1981, and it's really, really a cool movie. I recommend it. Like, if you've seen Part 1, of course you would want to see Part 2. It's really cool, and it's like one of those, even if you've seen it, I can always watch it again. It's really a cool movie.
So yeah, that was my review of Friday the 13th Part 2, and my next movie review will be on Friday the 13th Part 3.